First opening remarks will come from Professor Christopher Coker from London School of Economics, known to most of you, I guess, and the title is The Changing Nature, Ethics and Dynamics of Armed Conflicts. Please, Mr. Coker.
I don't have any PowerPoint, no, sorry. Yes, although I'm talking on technology, I don't do technology, so I don't do PowerPoints. I have a very complex relationship with them, which is not for the good. Now, what I'm going to tell you in my 10 minutes, it actually follows on from what we discussed in the last panel. And it was very interesting. One of the panelists said, if we took humans out of the loop, would it still be war? What is war? Thucydides had one definition for it. Not very elegant, but I think it actually sums it up. To anthropon, it's the human thing. It's what human beings do. But there's a very interesting passage in his history in which he describes an encounter between an Athenian and a Spartan. And the Athenian asks the Spartan, were the men who died your friends yesterday on the battlefield? Were they brave men or were they cowards? And the Spartan says, well, it would be remarkable if we could produce a weapon that could actually tell the difference between a brave man and a coward. And of course, if that was possible, if such a weapon had been produced, it would have killed the cowards, not the brave men. Today, we would kill the brave men and preserve the lives of the cowards, the non-belligerents, the civilians, etc. So the choice that we actually make is what makes war a human thing. But what happens if we're no longer making the choices? Our weapons are making the choices. So there's nothing like an Economist headline, and one I saw 2 weeks ago was Taming the Terminators. And it added, of course, that the campaign to stop killer robots it combines two of the tropes of science fiction upon which we touched this morning. The weapon system, which is completely new, and the encounter with a non-human intelligence that might one day find it difficult to appreciate the value of human life and the significance of its loss. And that's what we're talking about, what I will talk about in the minutes that remain, autonomous weapon systems. And we also, yesterday in the morning, talked about the future. And as William Gibson, one of my favorite science fiction writers, said, the problem is the future is never evenly distributed. So it arrives in some places earlier, and it arrives in other places later. Some countries are forging ahead with robots, and two countries, China and the United States, have already embarked on an arms race to develop artificial intelligence. We all come from the West here, so the ethical implications are very important. Stop the Killer Robot campaign may be a universal campaign, but it is powered entirely by Western countries and Western organizations and Western institutions. And when we fight war, we in the West do so in terms of just war theory. We've done that for the last 50 years. Some have aspired to do it a little earlier than that. So what's the importance about technology generally? Technology does three things. First of all, it helps us go out of the dirty and dangerous business. So that's why we clear minefields with robots rather than human beings. And I can imagine that robots will be patrolling the streets, stopping people, questioning them. They already do so on border controls in Palestine. Secondly, they do things better than us, like managing other machines. But thirdly, they do things we didn't think we could do. And that is the important point. Let me just mention non-lethal weapons. 100 years ago, who would have imagined that we could actually produce non-lethal weapons, that we could make war less kinetic, that we could address humanity in war? That's not a robotic system, of course, although one can imagine it. Let me mention something else, because we also touched upon virtual reality yesterday. There's a game called Athena, which is played in the Marine Corps University in the United States. Great thing about this playing of this game is that it enables you to identify people with superior skills. But it also enables you to identify people who have cognitive malfunction, who can't think in an emergency or in a situation where thinking and imagination is required. It also identifies people who are prepared to take risks and those who are not prepared to take risks. It also identifies people who have analytical blind spots. In other words, it factors out human fallibility. And that's extremely important, human fallibility, social psychology. And when we think of social psychology, we're thinking of things like confirmation bias, people who are confirmed in their misunderstandings, not willing to admit that they're wrong. We're looking at scenario fulfillment. We're looking at premature cognitive closure, when you just stop arguing. All of these are things describe the Brexit debate extremely well, by the way, because most members of Parliament suffer from this. All of them impair our ability to make the right judgment calls. But, as the philosopher Daniel Dennett tells us, they're not there for decision-making. They were programmed into us by natural selection so that we would identify enemies. And without enemies, we can't do emotional and social bonding. That's why we have these things. And decision-making is just a spin-off. So if we could produce machines that could take ethical decisions on our behalf, would that not be a good idea? And I have long argued against the campaign for killer robots on two grounds. One, they're coming, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. That's the history of technology. Can you think of a single technology that we haven't deployed in history? It's farcical to imagine that you can actually stop this development. So the next best thing is to capitalize on this development and see whether we can actually program ethical protocols into the machines that we are designing. And I just mentioned two, because two of the big objections to killer robots are human control and human dignity. Well, what control do we actually have in war? We get stressed out. We dehumanize our enemies. We tell ourselves they're gooks or towelheads or whatever. We deploy badly trained soldiers. And in certain situations, even well-trained soldiers will do the wrong thing because that is human. It's called bounded morality. We exercise our morality in certain situations. My favorite example of this is a seminary in Princeton where they told the students to come up with a lecture, a sermon, I should say, not a lecture, on the parable of the Good Samaritan. And all these students did a wonderful job sermonizing on the lessons to be learned from that parable. And then they were told they had to go to their next assignment, and they were already late. And as they left the room, there was a guy who was on the ground. He was actually an actor pretending to be a homeless person in distress. With one exception, they all crossed to the other side to avoid him because they were late for their next appointment. That's bounded morality. That's what human beings do. Machines might be different. And the second point I will make, and I'll conclude on this, is the Martins Clause, Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, that we should kill people consistent with their human dignity, with what's called the dictates of public conscience. Well, quite frankly, if I'm about to be killed, I don't really worry whether it's going to be a robot or whether it's going to be an Apache helicopter pilot or whether it's going to be a missile delivered by somebody in the loop or on the loop. I'm still going to be killed. And I think what we recognize here is an extraordinary human fallacy, which is the one human right that we seem to be holding on to is the right to be killed by a fellow human being. And the late Barbara Ehrenreich summed it up extremely well when she said, that's a right we've given ourselves 25,000 years ago. Because before that, we were killed by animals. Before that, we were the prey. After that, we became the predator. And we celebrated this fact by killing all the animals that killed us, like saber-toothed tigers, or hunting down poor old mammoth elephants that were still roaming the earth 10,000 years ago. And now, we're horrified at the thought that we might be the prey. That is the Terminator nightmare, and that's why that franchise has done so well. So I'm going to end with just one last remark, because my 10 minutes is certainly up, and that is, although I am in favor, not of killer robots, but I am in favor of introducing artificial intelligence in war, because I think it will make war more humane, I am also very concerned that it will give us a let-out clause to abdicate responsibility for our actions. It reminds me of a wonderful book by Douglas Adams, he of the famous Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but he wrote another book called Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. And in this imagined future in the 23rd century, there's a robot for everything. You can even buy a robot called an electric monk that will believe in God for you. And if you have enough money, you can buy the superior deluxe version that will believe in things they don't even believe in Salt Lake City. I once made the mistake of telling that joke at a Pentagon conference. 10% of people in that building are Mormons, as you know. So I never got invited back, but I hope I might be invited back.
I don't see any Mormons. You can spot them on the backpacks, really. But thank you. Thank you, Professor Coker.